Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2 just had one of its biggest updates ever release in the form of the Tech Marine. Today I've brought on First Tour Guardsman to talk about some future updates that might be brewing for Space Marine 2 and to really get into what we can expect in the future for this game. FTG, what are your expectations for the future of Space Marine 2?
My expectations for year 3 is that we're going to get an entirely new roadmap. I think it just makes a lot of financial success. Saber Interactive did come out recently, or I should say their Focus Entertainment community managers came out recently and said they were waiting to see how Tech Marine actually launched and what the response to it would be before they talked about future classes. And considering Tech Marine was like the most popular update for Space Marine 2, at least since patch 10, it has been pretty much a guarantee for me that we're going to be getting future classes in the game, or at the very least, a roadmap for year 3. Now, you and I did a video way back when talking about a potential year 3 for this game, and I think a lot of the points that we made there still hold true, that this game is a primary revenue earner for Pull Up Entertainment, the parent company of Focus, and because of that, because of the response to Tech Marine, I think we'll pretty much be guaranteeing a year 3 plan.
Yeah, one of the things that really impacted my expectations moving forward for Space Marine 2 was pretty much the Cosmetic Head DLC release. I feel like a lot of people were expecting significantly higher quality in that product, because it's something that you have to pay for outside of the annual pass. And we're going to be getting more of those. I think, I've seen some leaks of like White Scar's heads and stuff like that. So I'm hoping that we're going to get high quality stuff in year 3, but just judging by that cosmetic head DLC and kind of the lack of skins and stuff that we've been receiving at the tail end of year 2, I think that Saber is pretty much at the end of their content development pipeline of stuff that they had prepared before the game released. And so everything that we're seeing release now and everything that we're going to see release moving forward is going to be stuff that they make from scratch, and seemingly they're pretty slow at doing that. So my expectations are that in year 3 we're definitely going to get a new class, but we're probably going to see less skins, less paints or colors get added to the game, and then whenever we see something good get added, there's going to be a pretty high chance that they're going to monetize it as separate DLC. What do you think about
I
that?
don't I don't know if I necessarily agree that the content we got in year 2 was the end of what they actually had pre-planned before the game came out. I actually think year 2 was probably a push from Pull Up and Games Workshop, because a lot of the content we got this year compared to the first year of content was just way more substantial in my opinion. I think the champion skins were better, the customization was better, the entire effort for updates it just generally felt better. That might be a controversial statement to some, but as far as like modes like Siege Mode that originally came out in 2025. We're getting an update to that later this year as well. I don't really know why they would be doing that as like part of a huge pipeline for an entirely separate roadmap if it was like initially planned for the big launch of like what was probably supposed to be their biggest update for year 1.
Right.
And like we talked about before, having these updates just come out for like these DLC heads, I'm sure these will come out more often, and like they will try to monetize the game further and further. But Saber also said that we will be getting 2 heroic weapons for every single variant in the game, or every single weapon variant in the game. And I would say we could do that if we didn't have like a proper year 3, unless it was like super half-assed. But if we look at other Focus Entertainment games like World War Z, they still get updates to this day, and they are way less financially viable than, say, Space Marine 2 is. So I think the content will be pretty substantial.
Yeah, I think the content is certainly going to be there, specifically with things to do, things to engage with in the game. You mentioned the heroic weapons and everything. I think that primarily what's going to be impacted moving forward is going to be a lot of the cosmetic stuff. I 100% see a lot of cosmetic things basically being shifted potentially out of the annual pass, or just them creating more things alongside the annual pass, because although the voice pack was pretty low quality, or the heads were pretty low quality, I would imagine that tons of people still bought them. for one reason or another. They still bought them, and Saber's gonna, get the dollar signs in their eyes, and they're gonna continue to make them, and they're gonna continue to make things like them. But otherwise, yeah, I think that we're gonna be moving forward with year 3. How much longer do you think we're gonna have to wait for like Space Marine 3?
Space Marine 3 is confirmed to have a 4-year dev cycle, like way back when an IGN interview they did, or I think it was a Warhammer TV interview. So 2029 it seems like the earliest release date for Space Marine 3, which makes me think we will probably get substantial content for at least 2 more years. I'd say content will probably slow down around 2028, but until then, Saber doesn't really give up on their games. That's not like the one Evil Dead game they did, which was like a pretty big travesty that they burned a lot of goodwill on. But for the most part, Space Marine 2 is doing pretty damn well. And like you said, the DLC voice packs, they probably did sell incredibly well. And we are getting another one for like Raven Guard and White Scars, and like probably another chapter as well. So I imagine we'll see like these little drip fed DLC packs over and over. But Saber has also come out, or the Focus Entertainment community managers have come out and said they know the response to this DLC was bad, and they're probably going to make a statement on it eventually. So I imagine the future DLC, like little packs they do like this, will be better quality, or at the very least, like handled a bit better in their marketing. So we'll see what they do with that.
Yeah, I think that for the most part, you're seeing this with. Oh, what I don't want to see is the situation with something like Bungie, where they've released a Marathon, and in doing that, they pushed the development for Destiny 2's future updates and their expansions and everything. They've pushed that all back, and they've pushed it to a pretty unreasonable date. They pushed it back by a couple of months, and there's really no promise that any future content is going to be releasing for Destiny 2 at all. But I feel like Saber is kind of in a different boat because Space Marine 2 is the flagship game, so I'm much more confident that it's going to be receiving updates moving forward, and that when Space Marine 3 eventually comes out, they would have just completely milked Space Marine 2 for all that it's worth. What do you think is there a world that exists where Space Marine 2 exists alongside Space Marine 3, which potentially has completely drastic gameplay features and everything, or do you think that there will be significantly more asset reuse in Space Marine 3, and it'll basically just kind of be just a direct sequel of the game, just an upgrade in every way? What are your thoughts on that?
I would say for Space Marine 3, I think that's where like all their dev time is going to go towards once it actually comes out. I think Space Marine 2 will probably be a better game at the point that Space Marine 3 launches, because the team that is currently working on Space Marine 2 is not the same team that initially worked on Space Marine 2 in its development phase. Like they're like a skeleton crew effectively, and they've actually come out and said that, I believe, even on like the Shocknade stuff they had, that was a original dev decision, and they went back and rebalanced that later. Like Focus actually came out and said that. So I imagine that Space Marine 2's dev team now, the balance decisions that Dmitry Grigorenko makes, are not going to be impacting Space Marine 3 that much in its launch. And maybe like way back or like way down the road, we're going to have the team from Space Marine 2 go into Space Marine 3 and do some balancing decisions there. But it's actually a worry I have that Space Marine 2's balance right now is light years better than it was at launch. And if
It
we
really
go
is.
backwards into like Space Marine 3 or like at launch, it's pretty much like, I don't know, 50% better compared to where Space Marine 2's launch was. It's still going to feel like shit by comparison to like whatever endgame state Space Marine 2 winds up in, because I imagine that like by the end of the life cycle of Space Marine 2, the game is probably going to be substantially better than it currently is in its life cycle. So I do hope that Space Marine 3 is in a pretty similar spot when it comes out. And if that means asset reuse, I don't think it's a bad thing, because Space Marine 2 will also likely have a ton of new bosses potentially like multiple new classes. And I hope that Space Marine 3 at the very least launches like 75% as to like where Space Marine 2 is at the end of its life cycle. But I'm not really going to hold my hopes out for that too much. I would just prefer that.
Yeah, I would certainly prefer something like that as well, and I also don't mind asset reuse as someone who's coming from like Dark Souls, Dark Souls 2, Dark Souls 3, Elden Ring. From Software reuses assets all the time, but they always innovate and improve on the things that they have. And when it comes to things like balance, for the most part, From Software balanced like Dark Souls 2 significantly better than Dark Souls, but in doing that, they kind of broke other things, and other things kind of became like the meta, so to speak, in terms of like PvE or PvP, which of course got ironed out over time. So I think that that's kind of a given that's probably going to happen regardless. Do you think that if we get more classes in Space Marine 2, if we get our Justiciar, if we get our Chaplain, Apothecary, or, Emperor Hopes, the Librarian, do you think that that will carry over to Space Marine 3, or do you think that it'd be much more likely that we'd see kind of a more clean slate, maybe a little bit of a mix-up, like a class shake-up in Space Marine 3, where the class releases with the Tech Marine, Librarian, Tactical, Assault, Bulwark, but then it doesn't release with like the Heavy or something, because that kind of just goes into the oven to continue to cook and get renovated, or what do you think that looks like?
I feel like Space Marine 3 is going to launch with like some major drawing class, like something like Librarian. Like I think a Librarian trailer for Space Marine 3 is like a launch class would go incredibly hard. As to whether or not
Yeah.
we will see the classes that Space Marine 2 has at the end of its life cycle in Space Marine 3 at launch. I kind of doubt that. Like maybe we'll see the Tech Marine. I can almost guarantee you all the classes from Space Marine 2 at launch will be in Space Marine 3 at launch as well. So, Vanguard, Bulwark, Assault, and stuff like that. But as to like if we'll see the DLC classes, I'm not so sure. Like I think it will probably launch with 7 classes no matter what at the very least. And there will be like an additional like super pulling class for players like that Librarian, like a Chaplain or something like that. That's not in Space Marine 2. But either way, I really think that Space Marine 2 will probably be the better game once Space Marine 3 comes out, at least in terms of content for the operations mode. I think most of the focus in Space Marine 3 will probably be on Titus and the campaign and expanding that with like maybe like 50%, 100% better operations from what we got launched in Space Marine 2.
Well, Darktide just released a new game mode that's kind of like a Helldivers 2 light. Do you think that we'd ever see something like that in, let's say, Space Marine 2 or Space Marine 3? I personally feel like it would work with Space Marine 2's combat and with the AI director and its class-based system and everything. Not sure what the rewards would look like for a game mode like that, but I do think that with enough procedural generation, you could launch with that alongside operations or instead of doing operations, and that would be a major innovation for something like a Space Marine 3 launch, especially if it is as replayable as Helldivers 2 was on its release. Do you think that that's possible for this? Do you think that that's within scope for Saber, or does their history say otherwise?
I don't think that's in scope for Saber. It really depends on like what scale they want to take Space Marine 3 to, like how hard Pull Up Entertainment's pushing them, how hard Games Workshop is pushing them. We don't really know anything about Space Marine 3 yet, other than that like Titus, Gadriel, and Sergeant Matoris are going to be in it most likely. And I would probably have to like look at Space Marine 2 at the end of its life cycle, like see where I think Space Marine 3 will probably wind up, or at least like kind of similar to its launch state. But as far as seeing like brand new crazy modes, kind of like Helldivers, nothing that Saber has done so far in Space Marine 2 makes me think that they're really creative enough for like a mode like that, to be entirely honest. They haven't really put out anything super crazy in the game. Like stratagems are nice, the stratagem modifiers are pretty cool, but like as far as like overall gameplay systems go, they're not too far off from like what we've had since launch. Most of their major changes are just additions of like weapons or classes, which are really good, but like as far as like groundbreaking modes go, Siege mode was undercooked at launch, so they'll be touching on that again, like I mentioned previously. We also had the Hard Stratagems mode come out, which is pretty good, but Hard Stratagems are like not super crazy in terms of like unique variants. Unique variants aren't very hard to make. It's very similar to something you'd see in Darktide. And I think generally Fat Shark's just a more creative company when it comes to PvE in general, so I don't think we're going to see that, to be honest. But we'll have to see what the scale of Space Marine 3 actually looks like.
Yeah, Saber, I think I would consider them more of a triple A gaming developer with a pretty massive financial backer. And for Fat Shark, the guys behind Darktide, I would see them more as like double A maybe a little bit, because they're really only working on like one or two projects at a time. Whereas Saber, they just had Toxic Commando release, and that's yet another Horde shooter, effectively. So it seems like they might be really trying to capitalize on this co-op horde shooter genre. So I think I agree with you. I don't think that they would kind of expand the scope of the game or what's in the game for Space Marine 3. They're just like, they know what the community wants, they know what they're good at making, and they're just going to keep making it. So I foresee that that's probably what everyone can expect for Space Marine 3. Hopefully they take a lot of our criticism and feedback into consideration, specifically for the story. Make something that's, you know, a campaign that's longer than like 10 hours. It'd be cool to get double or triple that, something truly epic. And for PvP as well, because I would love to see something like Battlefield or Battlefront, but in Warhammer 40k. But we'll see, because I feel like a lot of game development around Warhammer 40k video games is really constrained by Games Workshop. So you've always got Daddy Games Workshop looking over your shoulder, making sure that you're making things to their specifications as well, not breaking any lore with your gameplay, any of that. So I think that that kind of narrows down the scope a little bit. But I think that that's where we're going to wrap things up, guys. FTG, do you have anything to add to the future of Space Marine 2, what we could expect, Space Marine 3 even?
I would say I'm most looking forward to new weapons. I'm curious to see what they put out in a year 3 roadmap. That's like the real question right now to me is like, will we get a year 3? I think it's pretty obvious we will to some extent. But once we get that roadmap, once we see like how far Saber is willing to push this, I think we'll have way more answers on like just what we can expect over like the course of the next like 3 or so years of Space Marine 2. Because if we get a year 3, we're probably gonna get a year 4, or we might even get a year 5. So I'll probably just wait for that.
Yeah, I'm definitely waiting in anticipation. I saw a teaser that they'd put out, the Focus community managers, about great swords. So in my mind, it kind of seems like we're heading into the direction of Judiciaries or Chaplains and great swords being added to the game probably shortly before that, so that it can help sell the class a little bit. But everyone, thank you for joining us. The Emperor protects.